Salaam, Remi, it's great to see you. We've met multiple times now, so I don't need to go through, hopefully, the whole explanation of how much your music has moved me throughout my life. And I'm really thrilled to be able to see you, but obviously we find ourselves at anniversary right here. And for me, it's always interesting to kind of pay respects to anniversaries, especially when the artist who created the body of work is no longer with us. It has to be done really thoughtfully. And so the question to you as someone who was, first and foremost, great friends with Amy Winehouse, and then a great collaborator. Does it feel like 15 years since Back to Black came out?
At this moment, it does, because we were at a time when time has slowed down or sped up, or we don't know what type of time machine we're in for the last couple of years. So at this moment, I look back at it and I'm like, wow, a lot of things have transpired since then. And even when, Amy passed 10 years ago, it was still a thing for me when I looked and said, wow, within 10 years of me meeting her, she came and really made her mark in this stuff. So I can see the 15 years since Back to Black. I can see the 20, almost 19 years since we started Frank. We're different people now. We're continuing to grow, but one thing is alive is that we will be here forever through the music.
Yeah.
And, the art that we create will outlive all of us. So, be careful of the seeds you plant, because the trees will be here forever.
This is a beautiful tree. This record and both albums that you worked with Amy on, aging gracefully and beautifully and meaningfully. Back to Black has a very specific place in people's hearts, I think, because it speaks very fluently the language of heartbreak and the desire to pull oneself back together. Looking back on it now, your experience of making this record with Amy, how much of it was being thought through by her and how much of it was just pure instinct and just dwelling in her feelings and trying to express?
What was interesting is that Amy was someone that I would use the Carpenter's rule of thumb, which is measure twice, cut once. And, a lot of times in the habit of how we got to cutting records, half of the songs I did on Back to Black were actually written in between the Frank period. Like, those times when we were going to go back and add songs to Frank. And that's where Addicted and what became Just Friends came from. And then, me and Mr. Jones was, so that was actually, all those things were leading up to it. But I feel that her thoughts on, even when we did, like, say, Tears Dry on Your Own, which she wrote, like, in my garden, basically, she probably wrote for like a week every day. Like, what? I got the first two lines here. What do you think? Okay, cool. And then she'd go back out and it'd be days. I'm like, hey, you want to take the guitar? She's like, no, I don't need the guitar. I just want to think, I know how many syllables I need for the lines or whatever it is. And she would just go through modes and really think about it. But then when I went back to the vocal takes of a lot of things, except for Tears Dry, the fast version, but just in general, when she was recording them, she would maybe cut it one or two times. Which I didn't really notice the same way. I knew it wasn't much, but after she passed and I really went back and listened to them and just, wanted to relive what exactly just happened here. The reality is that Amy would think about things and then do it, and then certain things she would just say it off the cuff and be like, oh, that's good, I like that, and then keep it. So it was the combination of her knowing how she felt, being in touch with her feelings, but also when it came down to the lyrical performance of them and how she wanted the lines to line up, and how she wanted it to be felt on first listen. You didn't really have to figure it out. That was very calculated and put to a point to where it was just like, now I'm just performing because I've already lived these words and they mean something to me.
The whole album is essential start to finish, which is why it's an essential album. We're having this conversation and paying our respects at 15 years. But there are moments that you hear that continue to jump off that record. People continue to play them over and over again in varying different capacities. And Tears Dry on Their Own is one of those moments that really connected above and beyond the greater mass. Can you tell us a little bit of a story about Amy writing that song? You mentioned it was in your backyard, and just elaborate a little bit on that experience.
It started, like, when I look back through the files, the first file of it on the first day said darkness. And it was like, starting with the first line, all I ever be to you is the darkness we once knew. And then, I had a version of her just singing that over and over, for 2 minutes, like, although everything that you, the darkness was running, da 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 da. And then she came up with two more lines. And, that was kind of like, probably 8 lunches and many days of just figuring out what she wanted to say. But once we had the song and the down-tempo version of it originally, we had so many songs that were in a similar tempo, and she had a comfort zone of writing in a certain space that was great because many artists, kind of do their blueprints at one space and then they find different beats to put it on or find different ways. And I was like, we need more up-tempos. So I decided I was listening to Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Stems were available somewhere online at that time. And I was like, this could work. So then I replayed the Ain't No Mountain High Enough stuff and then got her to sing it in the up-tempo. And that took some time for her to get used to singing it at 120 instead of 85.
Yeah.
But when she got to it, it was kind of like the juxtaposition of something that felt uplifting under something that was actually sad lyrically.
And there's the album, and to some degree, there are moments like the title track and other moments that are just very, very overtly sad, and the job is to make you understand how deep we can go when we're hurt. But there are so many songs where the underlying themes are disruptive and challenging and stressful, and yet the music has this optimism to it. What was it like when she was recording these songs? Because obviously when she was writing them, she was digging somewhere deep. But again, the performances don't always reflect that. The performances make you want to dance.
I've never felt like she was depressed because of heartbreak. She would find ways to take the heartbreak and dig at the person. The whole Frank album was digging at one person. Back to Black is probably like 3 different people, but she's digging at them, calling them all types of names and everything else. So I think that in the aspect of it being heartbreak, still as the person was sitting there, you weren't getting, I'm heartbroken. You were getting, I'm going to take the piss out of you for thinking you're going to do something to me. And it's going to be a little bit of a cat fight of arguments, but then put into such nice soliloquies with wonderful melodies in a way where it's addictive.
You and Amy developed this friendship over her recording career. It's not like she pulled you in to specifically work on Back to Black. Are you any closer now with the benefit of some hindsight and the wisdom of having recorded with her life too short? What it was that she saw in you and why she chose you to collaborate with consistently?
I let her do what she wanted to do. That was my whole mode. It still is my whole mode. I mean, besides her respecting the work that I'd done with other people, she really came to me because she liked the record I did for Left Eye Lopez called Block Party. And she went to EMI Publishing looking for whoever did that record, and it was me. And then when they convinced me to take the meeting with her, that first day we wrote, I Heard Love Is Blind and Cherry, which is my nickname that I still called her. When she meet people with me, she's like, hi, my name is Cherry.
Yeah.
That's became She's Cherry now. But ultimately, it was a trust factor because I let her do what she wanted to do. She's like, can I swear? Say whatever you want to say. We'll clean it up later. And that freedom allowed her to come to Miami and look back at England and write stories about what was going on in England. What she told me ultimately was that when she listened to the records that we did, she heard herself. She didn't hear production on her. And that's kind of like how I produce is really vocal centric. We do a song, I get the vocal, and then I build around the vocal to make sure that every instrument is working into the vocal. And our time was really spent constructing a song over basic skeletons, and then I would arrange it, but always making sure that you got her. And then on the friend level, I talked to her more than I recorded with her, realistically. She would pop up on my Skype, or, if we were doing something right now and I'm really busy, like my other phone might be right here and she'd be on it just watching what I'm doing or saying stuff. Like we really connected on a brother-sister level. So it was always that, with respect involved, kind of like a big brother.
What's fascinating to me is that, yourself and Mark were able to make a cohesive project, separate but together, if you know what I mean. And yet, if you close your eyes and don't look at the track listing and whatever, you can tell, if you're a fan of both your work, the distinctive individual qualities that you bring. But there is a cohesive sound to the record. And I sort of wonder whether that was just an unspoken thing or Amy kind of guided it, and how the album became this kind of instant vintage sound, which people confused for retro, but to me was ultimately more of a sort of love letter to hip hop in a weird way than it was to kind of the 60s.
I mean, my process started in the Frank space. Like I said, out of the 6 songs on Black to Black, 3 of them I did during the Frank time. And what I went for at that time was when I first met her, there was a neo-soul movement that was huge. The Erykah Badu, the Philly sound, like all those different things. And when I heard her singing in a jazzy type way, I intentionally didn't want to make it sound like what had been happening. So I went more hip hop and more jazz because she is a child of the hip hop generation. And, you know, that's really my space. I felt that that came across in our selections. And Mark also being a hip hop, you know, producer in that generation as well. You know, the things that I play are the things I would sample. So then when it's time to come back around, hey, we got to finish these songs, Darkest called me and was like, hey, how are we going to make this feel like one thing? Because these are in one space and that's another. I just looked at it all because I understood it was her. I was like, remember, the thread through this whole thing is Amy as the thread. If we make Amy the thread, then wherever we go musically, it now brings out other touches.
When you think about this album and what it means to everybody, it's one thing. But as it's gone on over 15 years, have you allowed yourself to listen to it? Have there been moments when you've been able to appreciate it, have some distance and understand what it was that you were a part of?
I think that I didn't know at the time exactly, you know, that it was going to be what it was. But I felt like I knew when I met her at 18, the phrase I would always say to everyone is, this is what she's doing at 18. What's she going to be able to do at 25? I felt the growth in her. You know, I was able to introduce music to her and turn it around. So with Back to Black, you know, it was once again, I was able to be a part of an album like The Score by the Fugees or something that I saw them from, you know, record one of people not being sure if they liked them to now seeing their second album skyrocket because they had that first album of artist development, character development, and everything else. It's kind of like when you're able to watch a mini series instead of just getting one movie and then needing to go back. You're able to see the character develop and really become that much closer to them. I love, you know, the things about it that came across. I've recently, like I just got my bass rejigged that I played on the album.
That's beautiful.
Which, you know, this is like something that I bought from Fat Dog and Berkeley Guitars and, you know, Subway Guitars in Berkeley, California. And I was like, wow, I need this bass. And that was the bass I played on all those things. But I'd put it away, actually, and stopped playing it after that time. So now it's just like getting back in touch to say, okay, what did happen there? When I've gone back through the tapes and listened to it and realized, you know, ultimately it was raw emotion. It was raw goodness. It was great ingredients, and the output of it was great because it was well executed.
I think a lot of people trace the tragedy that occurred when Amy's passed away back to this album and somehow make some kind of connection. And you've really thoughtfully explained that actually during the making of the record, she was taking control and trying to put humor in and wasn't playing a victim necessarily. So it must have been especially difficult for you and for those closest to her to see life start to take a different turn after that album came out, because, you know, it just seemed to unravel so quickly. And you just talked about bringing the bass out and how it took you time to be able to do that. And I know it's still raw, but what are some of your sort of most fond memories of Amy when we think about the human, the person?
I just think it's a general jokester. You know, it's just absolute. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and there's like a jazz cafe, and then I remember sitting in Cotton's and her walking up to Cotton's and sitting in the restaurant with me, and then just saying all types of, like, I'm on a business meeting with somebody. She's like, you're at Cotton's, I'm coming by. And she pops up and she just says all types of ridiculousness and then looks at me like, okay, I think I'm gonna go now. Just as the lyrics are sharp, anything in Stronger Than Me, anything in Just Friends, that would just be everyday life. Like, why did you say that? And did you really say that? It's almost like when you have a bad kid and the kid does something and you're trying not to laugh, because if you laugh, then the kid's going to keep going. Well, she was that kid. Hot and Cold. Hey, I love that song. Play it on repeat. Hey, I don't like that song. Delete it out of my iTunes so it never plays again.
Wow.
You know, being in London that day and on my way to meet her when I found out, you know, I was literally on my way to her house, picking up some food, then saying, hey, I'll be there in a minute. And then it was another outcome. It's still something that hits me, and it made me question, you know, I was approaching my 40th birthday then, you know, I'm approaching my 50th now, you know, but I met her a week or two after my 30th. The reality is that, you know, what we've done, her inspiration, she was inspired by people that arrived before she was born. She will inspire people that are born after she's gone. And, you know, that's why we do this. We plant seeds for shade that we'll never see, and, you know, with shade that we'll never feel and fruit that we'll never eat. This is for the future.
probably the most vulnerable record you ever made, and that's not to create sort of a hierarchy because I'm a big fan of Joanne and I know what that album means to Gaga, but I think everybody also recognizes the enormous honest value in Amy's record. And that's a really moving moment. I've heard that story from you personally, on and off the record, before. And every time you tell it, I get emotional. Because I can't to this day tell, I don't know if you can, from the way you tell the story, whether Amy was aware of what she was pulling out of herself in that moment and was just trying to protect herself, or whether it only became apparent later on through that magic of subconscious creativity that she was digging somewhere very, very deep that would ultimately change the course of her life.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we were walking down the street in New York. I'm actually in my old studio where I met Amy. This was like the first day she came up here and played me a bunch of songs on a nylon string guitar. And on the second or third day, the first day we wrote Back to Black and we had a good rhythm. Back to Black was the first song that we wrote together, but really for that one, I gave her the piano thing on a little CD Discman, and she took that in the headphones and went in the back room and just kind of scribbled for an hour. Yeah, she took this piece of paper in the back, and she wrote the lyrics to Back to Black, and I think she probably in an hour and came back in the studio.
And look at all the love hearts. Just quickly, I just got to focus on that for a second. I mean, look at all the iconography around there, the love hearts and whatnot. And that song is about. I mean, it is a love song. That's what's really tragic about it, right? Is that it's a classic unrequited love song, which is the hardest of all to write, I think.
Yeah.
And look at all, but look at all the love hearts there. It's clear what the intention of that song was. It wasn't like a I'm leaving you song. It was like a please come back song.
I gotta get this shit in a museum. I don't even deserve to be having this. And now I'm looking at like literally as she was writing the first lyrics, and you're right with the hearts, and it's like it really is like a look into her mind at that moment and what she was feeling. This is so wild. Well, she wrote this chords to the jazz standard Mr. Magic on the other little corner, and then this guy Bronk has his phone number that she must have like met in the club the night before. It's such a, yeah.
In the moment when you see that footage and the way you describe it, she's all business. She's like, I love it. Let's do it. Laying it down. Done.
I'm literally staring at the piano that we wrote Back to Black on, but I can't get in there and keep the audio decent.
Does that piano sound forever like that song to you now? You know how instruments, once you record them and they become something iconic within the context of the song, sort of change for people? Is that the Back to Black piano now for you?
I mean, it's just a Yamaha upright that I think I got from my parents. It was probably from the 80s that moved to LA with me and then came back. I mean, it's not a fancy or particularly, it's not like you go to the Dat King studio and there's an old 30s tack piano or like going to Abbey Road, but it does just have a sound and an attack on it. It's not even the one that we used on the recording. It's just the one that we wrote it on. But yeah, it does. It's just there and it's sitting in the same room that we wrote it in, and it feels kind of like, it's wild that everything happened on the past 15 years since I met Amy and we did that stuff. Like I'm back in that same room, staring into the same live room with the same, I got a little more gear now, but still a lot of the same.
Did you get flooded with memories, or have things crept up on you just during the time that you've been back in that room?
I came back actually to the room because it was September 14th, 2020, and I was walking past, and it's Amy's birthday, and I was like, I walked past the building. I was in New York, and I said, let me just go up there and take a picture, even if it's just something corny like the gram. Like, here's a room that we, wrote these songs in. And I buzzed the landlord, or I buzzed the buzzard and the super. I'm like, hey, I'm Mark Ronson. It's like typical New York, but it's like, it probably sounds like is what I'm talking. I'm like, I don't know if you know, I remember I used to rent this place and da-da-da, and I was just wondering if I could take up it, like telling this long-winded story, like, and I could just tell he didn't have the time for it. And he was like, what? You want to rent this space again? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, just anything to get in the building. And then I came up here, and it was like a lot of commercial places after COVID New York. Like, they would just look like people had yanked the phones out of the wall and ran. It was probably like a jingle house or something for a while. And I just looked around, and I started to get overwhelmed with this emotion. I saw the room that we had done all that work, and I was like, you know what? Yeah, why wouldn't I take this place again? So it's definitely... that was in some ways, of course, I had made records before that and done stuff, but that was really the start of my career for all intents and purposes. The stuff that me and Amy did, you know, in that room and then at that tone.
Did you both ever get a chance to really reflect on that observation, that album changed her life and your life? Did you allow yourselves ever a moment together, even at a party or an award ceremony, or even just separately, to say, wow, like, we created something really special here?
Well, the first time that happened, there was a couple really lovely times along the way, like even before the record came out. So she got the album, the CD, probably for the first time, because she hadn't met the Dap Kings, the musicians that had played on it, because we had written all this stuff, and she had to go back to London for visa issues. So she trusted me to track the band. And then she came back and did vocals later. So she's reading the CD booklet. She calls me. I'm in like one of those Hudson news agents in the airport somewhere I pick up. She goes, do you mean to tell me there's a guy named Binky Griptight that played guitar on my album? And I'm like, yeah, he's amazing. He's in that band, the Dap Kings. But she was just like, it was just such a funny moment. Like, she was like listening. We had already like bonded over this music, but it was just so crazy that the record was coming out and there was this guy that she hadn't met. And so then she came to New York once the album was out. And this was like in that days when like maybe an album would come out like 3 months later in America. It's so crazy to think that used to happen like that, or like movies or things like that. But so she came, and I don't think the album was out yet in America. And I took her to Brooklyn to meet all the musicians, the Dap King guys, and Tommy and Nick and Homer and Binky. And it was just amazing because they were there all meeting, and there wasn't loads of like sales, I think, at that point, but everyone knew that record was something special. And here they are like, oh, we did this wonderful thing together. And so there was this really joyous vibe in the studio that day. And then that's when I was wrapping up versions. So we did Valerie as well. But she was like, it was so like this lovely moment. And then she always had this, even though they weren't her touring band, she always had this really strong affinity for all those guys.
You know, I think one of the things that everybody is always connected with on that album, and in fact, Amy as a performer and an artist and subsequently a human being, is her voice. That's what everyone talks about, is her voice, her ability to be able to sing and convey emotion. How can you give us some insight into how she and subsequently yourself decided that is the take? When someone is so naturally gifted and can sing runs and land things with natural talent, how do you know that's the one that we're going to hear?
She would do 3 or 4 takes, and because she was really like a jazz musician, the way she sung, she would have different melodies. I mean, there was always like the hook would be kind of the same. I don't know, because I haven't listened to the alternate takes in a long time, but they were pretty different. And it, you know, that's why when she sang live, it wasn't necessarily like the record, because she wasn't just doing it to antagonize the audience. That's what was exciting to her to create. I remember being at her first shows and being like a stage mom, like by the side, like, you did it. Why aren't you singing it like the record? And that was just like dumb of me to expect her to do that. You wouldn't sing to Billie Holiday and be like, John Coltrane, be like, why don't you play it like you did on the record? It's like, I don't even remember the record. So she would do about 4 takes usually. And then she trusted me to kind of just comp and just take lines from the tape. I would always listen to every vocal for each line as we went along and pick the bits that I liked the most. And she kind of trusted me to let me do it like that.
So 15 years since that album came out, that's for me, that's a real one because it doesn't feel like that at all. Like you hear about these anniversaries. I was thinking about the album and the process this morning. I couldn't get my head around the time frame. What does that mean to you? What is 15? I mean, I know a lot's happened in your life, and there was the tragic loss of Amy around the middle of that time frame. But how does that relate to you? The idea of an album like this being 15 years old.
It's weird. Like, if I wasn't sitting in the room where we made it, it might feel really distant as well. But it feels like, it doesn't feel like 15 years ago. That's for sure. Yeah, I don't even know how to answer it because it's like I know it was a long time ago, and I know it was the sort of start of my career, and there's other things. And strangely, Amy's passing seems further away than us meeting, if that makes any sense. Especially because that's more present in my mind, and those are the memories that I've probably carried with me more than other stuff. So, yeah, like every day I woke up the stoop to come up to the studio, which is the first place I met her on that day when she was just like there, like trying to buzz in. So she's, I think just especially because being here and everything now, it's really, I think about her a lot.